adding initials to her title, because she is just seems to be continually learning and extending her knowledge and her contribution to science. But she received her degree in human biochemistry from the University of Alberta, residency in Saskatchewan, followed by a breast fellowship at University of Texas, MD Anderson, and then an MPH at Harvard School of Public Health, and an MA in bioethics and medical humanities from the University of Louisville. She built the first breast nationally accredited breast center in Kentucky, and then went on to Yale, where she's a full professor in surgery. She's a prolific researcher, and I welcome her to the podium for the Edgar J. Poth Memorial Lecture. Denise.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here to give the Edgar J. Poth Memorial Lecture. This is actually my second time giving the Poth Lecture. I don't know whether that's a good sign or a bad sign. Maybe it's meant to be a redo. In any event, I wanted to take a few minutes today to talk about change. These are my disclosures, none of which are particularly relevant for today's conversation. But happy tax day. So Ben Franklin said, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes. And I'm no Ben Franklin, but I think he might not have had it completely right. I would have said, in this world, nothing can be said to be certain except death and taxes and change. And certainly all of us have seen a great deal of change over the last several years when we faced an unprecedented global pandemic. But in truth, we see change around us every day. We see it with the changing of the seasons. We see it with different phases of the moon. We see it even with the evolution of mankind, right? Change is all around us. And arguably in everything we do as academics, as scientists, as surgeons, change is a big part of this. So when we think about research, and we've certainly seen that here today and over the course of the last several days at this conference, research is all about change, and we are the drivers of that change. Indeed, research is simply the process of researching, searching over and over again, not to maintain the status quo, but indeed to make positive contributions and changes. So if we think about what I do, so in breast cancer, we've seen change. We started with axillary lymph node dissection in everybody. When I was training, that was standard of care. And then we moved to sentinel node biopsy and only doing an axillary node dissection if the sentinel node was positive. And then we moved with Z11 to sentinel node biopsy alone, even if it was positive. And now we're even thinking about no sentinel lymph node biopsy for some patients, particularly those who are older. And one can only imagine how that might even be extended to be the vast majority of patients, and not just those who are over 70 years of age who have relatively early stage breast cancers. And with change, we continue to change how we think about paradigms that we have accepted as bona fide truths. If you look at any surgical textbook, I'm almost certain that you'll find this sentence somewhere in there. Axillary nodal status is the most important prognostic marker for patients with breast cancer. Indeed, I've written sentences that look a lot like that. But maybe we ought to rethink that. So we knew from the TAILOR-RX trial that in lymph node negative patients, it was really the genomic signature that predicted whether people should be getting chemotherapy or not. But now, even in lymph node positive patients, the latest data from the RxPonder data demonstrate that particularly in postmenopausal women who are node positive, it wasn't really the number of nodes that made a difference. It was their genomic score. Indeed, if you look at the number of nodes, all of those don't achieve statistical significance. So maybe we need to change some of our paradigms. Similarly, when we think about breast cancer surgery, we've moved from the concept of radical mastectomy to total mastectomy to lumpectomy. And now many of us are very comfortable in offering our patients breast-conserving surgery. But is that it? Are we satisfied with that as the status quo? Is there any change left to be made to that? Do we accept the paradigm that all breast cancers require surgery? What about this paradigm? Multicentric breast cancer is a contraindication to breast-conserving surgery. We've all seen this, and yet we now have challenged that paradigm. The ACOSOG 11102 trial demonstrated that no, for multicentric breast cancer, we can actually do breast-conserving surgery. Double lumpectomies are quite feasible, and the majority of patients can have breast-conserving surgery done in one operation, even for multicentric disease. What about this one? Surgery is the mainstay of therapy for patients with non-metastatic breast cancer. It's what a lot of us have grown up thinking, right? We as surgeons are the cornerstone of management. We're the only ones who can take this cancer out of breast cancer patients. But maybe it's time to rethink that as well. So we now have phase 2 data, at least from a multi-center trial. This is Henry Cure's trial called the Exceptional Responder Trial, where he looked at 50 patients who were enrolled. 42% were triple negative, 58% were HER2 positive. But we now know that systemic therapy is so effective in breast cancer that about 62% of these patients achieved a pathologic complete response. That is to say, there was no cancer left, no viable cancer left when it was removed. And so the concept was, well, maybe we don't need to remove this. And so in this trial, that's what they did. They gave neoadjuvant therapy. They did a bunch of core needle biopsies. The core needle biopsies demonstrated no further cancer. They treated with radiation. Magically, the surgeons were no longer in this equation. And truthfully, they found no ipsilateral breast tumor recurrences at 26.4 months. So now this has formed the basis of an ongoing phase 3 trial, and that's now expanded. So not only for the triple negative and the HER2 positive patients who respond so well to chemotherapy, but now to the luminal A cancers, those cancers who are hormone receptor positive. Maybe we can treat those with neoadjuvant endocrine therapy and again, step back, step out of the paradigm of breast cancer management, where surgeons had for so long been at the primary focus. The question that we as surgeons and scientists have always pondered is, how can we do things better? How can we improve outcomes? And part of that was recognizing what we don't know, or questioning truths that we had held so firmly to that might not be the truth. So one of the things that I had always held true was that I knew how to do a lumpectomy, right? Truthfully, there were many people who had written data. These are retrospective studies that had demonstrated that if you take a little bit more tissue around the cavity, you could reduce positive margin rates. And I remember being the discussant at the Central Surgical when Roshni Rao and her colleagues from UT Southwestern presented their data. And I said, that's bogus. I think I used a different word, but it's impossible, right, to say that you're taking more tissue but not taking more tissue at the same time, and that by taking more tissue, you magically could make the margins more negative. Maybe it was just that those surgeons were better. And in truth, that was what sparked it. That was what sparked the question of, well, do we really know? If I think that taking cavity shave margins doesn't make a difference and you think that it does, how do we settle the score? And so we did a randomized control trial, which was subsequently published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which demonstrated that I was wrong. And it is true that taking cavity shave margins reduced positive margin rates and re-excision rates by 50%. And those data have now been reproduced in a multi-center randomized control trial and in a number of other single-center randomized control trials, all of which show us the truth. And so now the question that we are investigating is, how often do we actually abide by new data? How often do we conform once we actually know the answer? And then there is always the unanswered questions. So part of the SHAVE trial demonstrated that in patients who were margin negative, remember, those are the patients who routinely we would have stepped back and said, congratulations, your margins are negative, off you go to radiation therapy. Well, in those patients in the SHAVE trial, we were blinded. We didn't know that their margins were going to be negative. But if those patients were randomized to have cavity shave margins, we took them. And we found that in about 12% of patients who had negative margins, there was disease in that shaved margin. So what's the impact of that on recurrence? Over the next year or two, we'll be gathering the 5-year data on SHAVE and SHAVE-2 that'll answer that question. And that too will be paradigm changing, because if it does demonstrate that there's a difference in terms of recurrence, well, then I think that we've got added data to demonstrate that we should all be doing cavity shave margin resections for breast cancer. But what if we're wrong? What if that didn't make a difference in terms of recurrence? What if in the current era of systemic therapy and radiation, margins don't matter? Well, then maybe that changes paradigms altogether again. Because if margins don't matter, does surgical resection even matter? And so it behooves us, I think, to challenge our own concepts that we've traditionally held very dear. And when the facts change, that we change our minds. Certainly in clinical care, we made a great deal of changes when one little virus came into our lives. And suddenly there was a shutdown of clinics and ORs and things that we would never delay. Now it was all of a sudden okay. We prioritized cases, and suddenly we would delay cases of patients who had DCIS. Patients who had ER/PR positive cancers were previously, we had poo-pooed the whole idea of neoadjuvant endocrine therapy. Now this became mainstay. And so this gave us a lesson of maybe the things that we had previously not thought of could actually be incorporated into our clinical practice. And what are the outcomes of that? This gives us a whole other realm to think about how we might make changes in the future. There was another huge shift to telemedicine. And it's not as if we didn't have that technology beforehand. But magically, when the pandemic happened, we all very rapidly turned to telemedicine, which has now become such a mainstay of how we practice. We've found that there were a great deal of benefits to telemedicine, often reducing disparities. Patients who would have difficulty in getting off work and traveling to get to see us now could hop on their computer and meet with us instantaneously. Oh, but wait, are there changes that need to be done there too? We did a study looking at things that we take for granted, like the internet. Turns out, very much like we found out in the pandemic, that if you look at national data, there are disparities in terms of who has access to what we consider an essential part of our lives. People who are older, who are poorer, who have less family income, who have less education, who have less insurance, guess what? They don't have access to internet. And so those disparities continue until, of course, we do something to change that. We also found that there was less screening, and many of us thought that this would be the end of the world, that all of a sudden, because screening had shut down, that we would face devastating increase in stage of breast cancer. So we looked at that, and we compared patients who were diagnosed April to June of 2020, right in the thick of the pandemic, versus those who had been diagnosed a year earlier using Flatiron data. And truthfully, we did see a difference in the proportion of patients who had stage 0 and stage 1 breast cancer. But if you control for other socio-demographic factors of who actually were coming in during that pandemic period, this didn't reach statistical significance. And so, is it really important to get screening every year? Or is the USPSTF data that had been based on those clinical trials that had all been based on biennial screening, is that still okay? You see, progress is impossible without change, and those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And so it is this perpetual change that we go through that really advances our clinical practice, as uncomfortable as that sometimes may be. What about in education? Well, certainly the pandemic had an effect in terms of how our residents and trainees got educated. In fact, how all of us got educated, how many conferences and tumor boards turned virtual. Magically, however, I don't know if you noticed this, but people actually showed up on time. The commute time was reduced and people could actually collaborate. I often say that I gave more international lectures during the pandemic than I had in the previous year, because somehow with reduced travel, it was actually a boon for international collaboration. But change isn't always unidirectional, and we've seen this as well. So when we looked at work hour restrictions, one would think that if work hour restrictions were good, that they would lead to fewer 80-hour work week violations and increased satisfaction, that if we were stricter with that, that would be better. But we found out through the first trial that that really didn't play a role. Because to improve is to change, but to be perfect is to change often, to continually reflect on the changes that we've made and question our assumptions. And finally, in terms of personal and professional development, there's been a lot of change there as well. Now, we all knew that burnout, particularly amongst medical professionals, was an epidemic even before the pandemic hit. But as the Surgeon General pointed out, the COVID-19 pandemic led to crisis levels of burnout. The pandemic further exacerbated this. When we think about 1 in 5 physicians planning to leave practice within 2 years and a projected shortage of 140,000 physicians by 2033, we need to take a step back and really think about what we're doing to address burnout. This is the Medscape survey of 2021, and you'll see here that for about 80% of us, burnout actually started before the pandemic. And if you're wondering where you're at on the list, so more than 1/3 of general surgeons are burnt out. And for those of you who do critical care, congratulations, more than 50% of you are. Now, I was really intrigued with the title of the presidential address on reflection, because I think that the pandemic has really given us a lot of opportunity to reflect. Many of us lost friends and colleagues, either to the pandemic or to cancer or to other unrelated things. Many of us had to spend time at home, often with our children, and we realized perhaps how important that was. Many of us had epiphanies about what was important and what wasn't. And some of us started doing some deep soul searching about what brings you joy and what really matters. And I hope all of you did that kind of reflection. And I think that because of a lot of that reflection, that led to what has affectionately been called the Great Resignation. For many of us, it was a mind shift. We went from this concept of grit, of being able to withstand whatever the challenge was. We were surgeons, gosh darn it. We could handle anything. It was a test of our mettle. And so we put up. But then we started to think again and to rethink whether that was truly the right answer, or in fact, whether there was some merit in walking away, or perhaps using our many talents, because we have many transferable talents, to do other things, or to reshape our worlds, or to negotiate for what was better, or to do things that brought us more joy. And for the institutions and the leadership out there who are facing the Great Resignation, well, the Surgeon General had some recommendations for you too. You see, there are ways that we could address burnout, and we could address things that lead to physician suicide and so on. Now, we knew all of these things too, but did we really do that? We all know that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. So if you don't like the result that you're getting, maybe you ought to think about change. So I hope in the last several minutes, I've talked a little bit about all of the things that we do, from research to clinical care to education to personal and professional development. And you've seen the one unifying theme, which is change. There is one other thing, though. So many of you saw Jason Smith on the national news recently. And I put his picture up here for a reason, because I would argue that our objective, our obligation perhaps, to change our profession, our personal lives, doesn't just stop there. We have an obligation, I would argue, to actually make a change for the things that matter to us. Now, this isn't meant to be a political speech, and I'm not going to go there, but I'm sure that all of us have things that are important to us, unless we think that we are living in this pristine utopia, which is perfect, which doesn't require any change. But if you think that there is something in the world that you can do that can make it just a little bit better, whether it's addressing gun violence, or whether it's addressing climate change or global poverty or disparities, or whatever it is that is your issue of choice, I encourage you to use your voice, because each of us in our own way is a leader. And we need to be the change that we want to see in the world. Every success story, whether it's personal, professional, or societal, is a tale of constant adaptation, revision, and change. And much like death and taxes, change can be intimidating. It can be anxiety-provoking, and we can feel like we have little control over it, and we may not really like it. But I would argue that change is fundamental, and it is important, and it is good. And while we alone may not be able to independently change the world, each of us can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. Thank you again for the privilege of the Edgar J. Poth Memorial Lecture.
I just told Anise that she never disappoints. It was a wonderful, wonderful named lecture. Thank you very much. Four. That's metal.
Thank you so much.
Yes, we have to pose for the picture. One more. Oh, thank you. So I think we have a little short break, maybe 15 minutes, and then quick shots here. Oh, business meeting. Where the heck am I? Then the business meeting. Okay, thank you.